Welcome, Kim.
Thank you, Kia. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you everyone for being here tonight for this edition of Writer to Writer. As Kia pointed out, this is our quarterly series in which writers have a conversation about interesting topics. And we're very excited that poet Mary Moore Easter and Professor Christopher Lehman will be our conversation partners tonight, discussing their individual pathways toward learning and writing about Eliza Winston, the slave woman who was emancipated here in Minnesota back in 1860. So just a little bit about More Than a Single Story. As Kia pointed out, we are a Twin Cities-based organization whose mission is to position the literary arts as a catalyst for cross-cultural healing and social justice. We connect BIPOC writers with broadly inclusive communities through readings, public conversations, writing workshops, and mentorships that foster insight, empathy, and literary skill building. Excuse me, I'm just getting over, a cold. And I just want to thank Hennepin County Library, especially Kia Vang, for her continued partnership and the voters of Minnesota for funding this initiative. So, More Than a Single Story also invites you to join us on Saturday, February 1st for another one of our programs called Embracing Our Roots. This will be a live event with our partners, the Gibbons Collection of African American Literature and the In Black Ink Publishing Initiative. The event will feature Dr. Hakeem Madabuti, who is founder of the oldest Black press in the world, and he will be in conversation with next generation poet Sean Webster. See our website for information about that and other events, and see Hennepin Library's website for their events as well. So I'm very, very excited about tonight's conversation partners. I just can't wait to hear them discuss their various pathways to researching Eliza Winston's life, her bondage in Mississippi, and her emancipation, which happened here in our own backyard. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ms. Winston or her experience, all you need to do is walk down the river at St. Anthony, Maine, and you will see a commemorative marker that acknowledges her and her journey. We will have time for questions and answers following tonight's conversation, and we'd like for you to feel free to post your questions in the chat, and then let's just begin. Let's welcome poet Mary Moore Easter and Professor Christopher P. Lehman, two award-winning authors who didn't know each other when they were each conducting research about Eliza Winston and writing about her in their own respective genres. Ms. Davis, could you spotlight them as well? Thank you. Mary Moore Easter, my dear friend, is the author of a memoir, The Way She Wants to Get There, and 4 books of poetry, including Free Papers, her book of amazing poems inspired by the testimony of Eliza Winston. She was the founder and director of Carleton College's dance program, and in 2022, Carleton College named her their new, their new studios in the Weitz Center for Creativity, the Mary Easter Dance Studios, to honor her legacy. Now emerita professor, she continues in her performance and written works an overlap of movement, words, and songs sourced from African American culture. She is the recipient of numerous awards for her writing and her choreography. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Carolyn.
And Dr. Christopher P. Lehman is a professor in the Department of Social Sciences at St. Cloud State University. He has written articles for Minnesota History Magazine and books about Minnesota's history. 7 books, actually. He is the 2023 winner of the Minnesota Humanities Center's Ruth Reister Award and the winner of the 2020 Minnesota Book Award in the Minnesota Nonfiction category for his book, Slavery's Reach, Southern Slave Holders in the North Star State. He has been a visiting fellow at Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African American Research. Now, on a personal level, I want to say that I really enjoyed reading his book, It Took Courage, his book about Eliza Winston. I was expecting a dry scholarly text, but instead found Professor Lehman's writing to be warm and accessible and very engaging. So thank you both for being here tonight. I am so excited.
Thank you.
So let's begin. So you both had a profound interest in Ms. Eliza Winston, and you ended up conducting massive research about her and then writing about her in your own respective genres. Could you please tell us about your journeys toward Eliza Winston?
Okay, who's going to go first?
You should go first since you wrote the book first.
Oh, okay. All right. That's great. Thank you, Christopher. You know, I had seen the very plaque that you were talking about, Carolyn, down by the river. I had seen it years ago, and I had made notes that this is something that interests me and I should look it up later. Well, years went by, didn't do a thing. And then what happened? This is what happened. And I'm going to read a poem that talks about it. Because the discovery of the launching of this idea was very sudden and important to me. All right, just a second. I've got tabs on all the pages, but that's okay.
All right, take your time.
Yeah. The first poem in the book, it's not the first poem. Request for Help is the first poem. I can't be the only one who didn't notice the universe warning at every step. Ground creeping apart, sea rising, plates of passage sliding shut. I was not foolish to ignore them, just persistent. So the slam of cymbals that froze my world surprised me. Worse, the mute to a silence without echo. Nothing breathed, no pulse of blood, no sap drip, no stone rolled. Instinct flared, no fight, only blind flight, pressing me into the past, breaking the seal of the present. 2, when you can't go forward, healing is in the past, the old folks used to say. I grappled for the gone bodies, slippery spirits toppling in failing mist. I fumbled the air for some one of them to write me. Known to be indifferent when inflicting pain, the universe poured forth mercy on me in Black abundance. Eliza is my gift to you. Eliza's trembling heart is my gift for you. Eliza's risk is my gift for you. Eliza's courage is my gift for you. Eliza's open eye is my gift to you. Next poem, In My Extremity. And that was the extremity I was just describing. There you were, Eliza, gold from God in plain sight. No one had picked you up, wiped the muck from the landscape of your face. Gold, I tell you, left for me to find, to polish. I won't say to own. We've had enough of that. I'm no colonizer of your shores, no conqueror to whom you must submit. Rather, a mirror that reflects what it sees. The you that was me, the background that was your time, the spaces surrounding you where I'd rummage and find my own things. Only grace could have offered the circumstance to me. The overlooked coin of the realm, a prize for the one who picks it up, recognizes a value previously unimagined. I feel anointed by the discovery of you, a realm at the beck and call of all that is fertile in me. My feet untethered to walk your fields, climb the mountains embossed under the black of your golden face. The old folks would shout, "Do, Jesus." Well, that's how I felt upon finding Eliza. And I'll just add to it, I'm going to let Christopher go in a second, but I went to the African American museum in North Minneapolis on that day of being so frazzled and so undecided about my life. And when I was there, they didn't have a lot. They had basically one large room. But I looked up on the wall and there was something I hadn't seen. The narrative of Eliza Winston. It was right there. It's like it fell in my lap. And from that moment, I was just completely taken with her. I mean, this is some research that I had said to myself, you know, I should follow up on this years ago, and I hadn't followed up on it. And here were her words. I did not, well, what I knew was that these were her words because they were printed in the newspaper. There were several versions. And at the time, I learned that court records were not published, but they were printed in newspapers. And I found several newspapers that had word for word the same testimony that she had given to the judge. So I took this as what was it, a sign? It was a voice from the past. I mean, it's not usual it's not usual to hear the voice of the enslaved speaking. Most of the works are written about the person from whatever perspective the writer chooses. And this was her voice. This was 3 pages of her voice. I took it all as literal, and I am learning since then that there was more research to be done. But that's the moment that I'm going to hand it over to Christopher. I just had this woman talking to me.
Thank you. I am not originally from Minnesota. I'm originally from Oklahoma, and I was raised in Edmond, Oklahoma, just north of Oklahoma City. And when I was 21, I moved from Oklahoma to Massachusetts to do graduate work in history and African American studies. And when I finished that work, there was a job waiting for me here in St. Cloud at St. Cloud State University. And when I arrived, I learned about there being African American slaves in St. Cloud. And I had never heard of enslaved people being in the North, let alone being in Minnesota, specifically in central Minnesota, on top of that. So that sparked my curiosity about local history. And I wanted to see if the enslaved people I saw in St. Cloud was just a fluke. And it turned out that there were enslaved people elsewhere in the state. And in my spare time, I would spend time going to census records that were digitized and look at how many African Americans I could find who were living in Minnesota in the 1850s and 1860s before the Civil War. And I would see where they were born, or which states they were listed as being born in, and look at their last names and then go back a decade or so and see if those last names coincided with names of slaveholders in those states. But I felt like that kind of research I was doing wasn't very conclusive. And I wanted to see what more I could find about the system of slavery itself. And it dawned on me about 10 years ago that since Minnesota became a territory in 1849 and became a state in 1858, but legal slavery didn't end until the 13th Amendment in 1865. That means that Minnesota as a territory and a state were in existence when slavery was legal in the country. So that meant that if anybody from a slave state came to Minnesota to buy land or invest in anything else in Minnesota before 1865, they could have been investing with money from slavery, money that their enslaved laborers generated on their plantations. So a light bulb went off in my head, and I decided to start going to county recorder offices in Minnesota, look up all their real estate deeds from before 1865, find names of people who were listed as buyers or sellers, who were listed with residences in the South. And every time I saw someone being from a Southern state, I would write that person's name down and the location down. And when I would go home at the end of my research day, then I would go to the database with the censuses and go to the slave schedule database specifically and see if any of the names that I wrote down were listed as slaveholders. And if they were, then I knew that that deed was a paper trail that says that money came from this slaveholder's plantation into the hands of this Minnesotan. And collecting information about all those deeds over a period of 4 or 5 years led to my previous book, Slavery's Reach. And a lot of the feedback that I received from that book was positive. The one regret that many readers shared with me was that in Slavery's Reach, I didn't give them anybody to root for. And in a way, that's a good thing, because if you'll notice the subtitle, the book is about Southern slaveholders in the North Star State. So the book is about slaveholders. It's not about enslaved people who fought for their freedom, even though I do mention a few of them in passing. But if you're not rooting for the slaveholders, I think that's a good thing. But I took their comments in stride, and I just told myself, let me go through Slavery's Reach and let me find the people who I mentioned who had been enslaved in Minnesota and became free. Whoever has the biggest paper trail, that's who I'm going to write about for my next book. And it turned out that Eliza Winston had the biggest paper trail. And I really enjoyed writing about her life. I found her story very fascinating. I was very pleasantly, well, not pleasantly, I was surprised beyond belief that there was a connection to the federal government that I didn't see coming at all, because in Eliza Winston's affidavit, she doesn't mention being connected at all to anyone in federal politics. But when I did the research of looking at recorder offices in Tennessee, where Eliza was from, to track down the enslavers and the receipts of when she was sold, I came across one that made my jaw drop. And that is the deed from 1842 from Lucius Polk to Mary Ann Walker and Catherine Golson. And it says, whereas on the 24th of July, 1834, they were sold at executor sale in the town of Nashville on the property of John C. McLemore, the Mr. McLemore in the affidavit, all his household and kitchen furniture, together with the following Negro slaves, one Negro woman named Eliza, one Negro girl named Linda, and one Negro boy named Julius, which furniture and Negroes was purchased by me and paid for by General Andrew Jackson. And I had to do a double take. But the Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson? So that took my research into a whole new direction to try to figure out all the different connections that Eliza had with the President of the United States. And following her journey with Andrew Jackson's in-laws from Tennessee all the way to Mississippi with the Christmases, and then up to Minnesota with Emily Gray and the other allies, it was just a fascinating story. And I don't think I was any more cautious about my writing than I was for this book, especially because I'm writing her story and I'm a man. So I saw a lot of advice from women who are scholars about how to tell the story of a woman's life without mansplaining. And what they said to me was to just make sure that I give Eliza as much agency and power over her life within her enslavement as I possibly could. So I hope that shows in the book.
It certainly does. And oh my goodness, Mary, you talked about her testimony. I'd like to hear more about her testimony from both of you. And Chris, oh my goodness, the paper trail and finding out these little nuggets that you didn't know before about, the connection with President Andrew Jackson, which you speak about a lot in the book, is quite fascinating. But
Yes.
let's hear more about how did she get here? What happened? What was the testimony that you mentioned, Mary, from both of you?
Yes. Well, all of a sudden I want to read three poems right away, but I'm especially interested in these names because Christopher has turned up something that, my jaw dropped reading the book about, the former president. I could not have unearthed that. I had plans to go to Memphis and do some research of my dancerly poet self, but COVID came and it was unwise to leave. So um, I'm going to read this. It's called Records in the Courtroom, but None of Her Life Before, which of course Christopher found that life. But this is the poem before I could find any of that. And the epigraph in it is Eliza signed her testimony with an X. And so the epigraph in this poem is for all of us who come from people who signed with X's. That's from Danez Smith. 1, someone took it down, their sworn duty to record every word. Only one sign of her sound, Macklemore, explained in parentheses, Macklemore. The tongue of her region, her status, her origin outside taught English. No further apostrophe or dropped consonant to interfere with eloquence and flow, like she could even back then, especially back then in the X-signed days, could rap and roll out her life with all its twists and turns and switchbacks, indignation in the unsaid. Another thing while I'm at it, I will say also I've never received 1 cent from my property in Memphis. Talk back, poking through a retort to coulda, woulda, shoulda freedom promises. Why didn't you give it in St. Louis? Someone took it down, and her voice lived right into my ear. 2, no one took down Eliza at 5 years old, at 4, at her mother's breast, or some other breast assigned to keep her alive when her mother's birth body gave out, worn down to its last act of giving her breath. Nothing documents the opposite. A mother's shield in the early days tied to her back, first steps, the surprise of quick speech, the shush of her tongue in danger. No one took down which loss cemented her concept of self. Quote, held as slave of Mr. Golson, raised by Mr. Macklemore, instead of daughter of, what name goes here, Eliza? Born of a woman like every one of us who draws breath and turns to ashes, born of a woman, flesh of her flesh, the one made two at first inhale of a world. What name? You can imagine how excited I was to find out her name from Christopher's book. But number 3, Macklemore, Golston, Christmas, Babbitt, Bigelow, King, Vanderburg. Around her names and histories abound, wives and progeny and property in records and deeds and diaries and newspapers and courtrooms and censuses and street addresses and cemeteries and votes. Eliza, a flame blown out, leaving smoke and the burnt end of a paper. So they were coming north, and this is what I wrote. Those who made 2 years' worth of her clothes tell about it. Eliza talks about her trunk, and she talks about her friends who helped to make clothes that would be what they imagined was appropriate for a Minnesota winter. They're down there in Mississippi in the heat, imagining what the Minnesota winter is going to be like. I found that screamingly funny because we try to imagine what it's going to be like every day. So here, the first woman speaks. He'd tell the land would be white in winter. He'd tell the white would be soft as cotton with thorns of ice, not growing from the ground, but falling from the sky. He'd tell what she gonna need for a body used to heat. I make a secret round my waist of mistress ripped pantaloons, stolen honey cover, smuggled down the slave line, ripped at will. She won't miss its rent, unmended. Plenty more where that come from. Second woman speaks. As long as these old fingers hold a thimble, you will not tremble in whatever cold they have for you, Eliza. You are not motherless without cover in your solitude. Take with you this vest with sleeves, stitched and doubled, cotton stuffed, these skirts and sack shirts closed with pilfered buttons, tagged with bits of cut-off ribbon to remind your joy to rise inside your obedient face, your fire to blaze inside whatever cold they have for you. Take us with you in each fold and pleat, armored by the freedom that you seek. So you asked me, how did they come? Yes. Up the river, way up from Shiloh Plantation, Mississippi to St. Anthony Falls, Minnesota. In droves they came. They left the heat behind, the Mississippi musk and heavy air. A change of scene would do them good, the falls and water rushing free in foam. They took their comforts with them. Cook, who kept the South inside their mouths. Slave who'd sleep on floor outside their door, waked at any whim or need. The hand that held the sickly head and kept the children out of mind. That hefted, smooth, and scurried, dark as nighttime in the day, invisible, a nothing to imagine with a plan. Eliza came, was brought along to hold the sickly head. She left the bondage of her home behind and left friends who knew her leaving was for good and kept her plan for freedom sealed. Left musk and heavy air and duties owned by those whose promises betrayed her trust. She did her very best, she said. A comfort to herself, her standard steady over churning water, her forward motion out of sight beneath the flashing surface of the paddle boat. She smoothed and scurried, closely confined, she said. By minutes, hours, days, nights, waiting to light on land, free land. Okay?
Oh,
Is that what you had in mind, Carolyn?
yes, yeah, that's
Yes, okay.
yes. And in that same vein, Chris, you were talking, you wrote quite a bit about her journey as well, and her life down in Mississippi, and how she already knew she had been promised freedom. And it sounds like she may have known or had some inkling that Minnesota was a free state and that she could get her freedom once she got here. And she was betrayed. She got so excited about it when she got here and realized, oh, wow, this is where I am. And she was betrayed by another slave woman when she first said, when the plans were first, in their beginning. But I'm going to shut up and let you talk about that because it's all just fascinating. You are muted.
Well, like Ms. Easter, I was really excited to know the names of Eliza's family. And when I was looking at different statements of transactions for Eliza, the earliest one that I could find for John McLemore was in 1822. And that is when McLemore buys Eliza. And like Eliza is 5 years old at the time. So that's when I learned that Eliza was born in 1817 instead of 1830, which she says in her affidavit. But in the receipt, it says that John McLemore purchases a man named Moses, 27 years old, Molly, a Negro woman about 24 years of age, George, a Negro boy about 9 years of age, a son of Molly's, Matilda, a Negro girl about 7 years of age, also Eliza, a Negro girl about 5 years of age, also Sally, a Negro girl about 3 years of age, all daughters of Molly, also Judah, a Negro woman about 40 years of age, the mother of Molly. So from this receipt of Eliza being purchased by John McLemore, I was able to learn that Eliza had a mother named Molly, a grandmother named Judah, and siblings named George, Matilda, and Sally. So Eliza was raised with the family, at least in her early childhood. And again, McLemore buys her in 1822. He's not terribly good with money, however. And in 1834, when Eliza's 17, McLemore has to sell all his property, including his people. And this is where President Andrew Jackson steps in. And in 1834, he is the sitting president. So from the White House, he's trying to figure out how to keep Eliza in the family of his in-laws. John McLemore was not only one of Jackson's best friends, but he was Jackson's in-law because McLemore married Jackson's wife's niece. So Jackson wanted to make sure, now that his wife was dead, that he take care of his wife's family as much as he can. So that for him, that meant that he could not let his niece's enslaved woman leave the family. She had to stay with the family, the Donaldsons. So from the White House, he arranges for another in-law to purchase Eliza, but only temporary until the youngest McLemore, Catherine, grows up and gets married. So when McLemore loses Eliza, Eliza has to go to Maury County, Tennessee, which is a rural area. And so she's on the polk plantation, and she becomes a rural slave as opposed to having been a domestic laborer in urban Nashville. But after 8 years in rural Maury County, it's time for Catherine to inherit Eliza. And at that point, Catherine lives in Memphis. So Eliza becomes an urban enslaved woman again. And because Catherine was only 12 when McLemore lost all the slaves and never did buy any new ones, Catherine didn't grow up learning how to be a slave mistress and how to take care of enslaved people. So when she inherited Eliza, she was relatively lenient as far as masters and mistresses go. I mean, she allowed Eliza, for one thing, to go to church by herself without her or her husband, Thomas Golson. And she chose a church where she'd be worshiping not only with other slaves like herself, but also with free African Americans and with masters, but also with white people or European Americans who did not own slaves at all. And so this was probably a revelation to her. Now, when I was doing research with digitized old newspapers, and I plugged in the name Eliza Golson to see what would come up. I was very surprised to find a listing from a post office in Memphis saying that there were letters at the post office waiting for Eliza Golson to pick up. That let me know that Eliza was literate. She learned how to read, if not to write. And I think it was that church in Memphis where she learned how to read and write. I don't think that anyone who had enslaved her would have had any kind of incentive to teach her. So she probably learned at the church. And after Catherine died, her husband made an arrangement with her for her to work outside the house, even get married outside the house, even though it wouldn't be a legal marriage, and to earn enough money to buy her freedom, which is called manumission. But he unfortunately passed away. Actually, he had run into money trouble too, just like Macklemore. And he pawned her to the Christmases, but he died before he could buy her back from the Christmases. So she was stuck in Mississippi as a result. But after 7 years of being in Mississippi, the Christmases decided that they would take her on their vacation to Minnesota to go to the Falls of St. Anthony because Mrs. Christmas was a sickly woman, and the falls had this great reputation of being these healing waters. If you were to go up the Mississippi River from the Deep South back then, you wouldn't make a straight trip on the same boat. The reason that Eliza specifically mentioned St. Louis and wanting to be freed in St. Louis is because St. Louis was the last stop going north that was in a slave state. So it would be at St. Louis where people would switch boats. And the reason is because going from the Deep South to St. Louis, everybody who's a crew member is a slave who's on loan from a plantation. If that boat had went any farther north, they would dock in water off of a free state, and they could just walk off the boat and be free. So the slaveholders who were loaning their slaves didn't want that. So in St. Louis, everybody who wanted to go farther north would just get on another boat that started from St. Louis and then went all the way to Minnesota. So Eliza thought that the Christmases were going to free her at that stop in St. Louis, but they didn't. They just took her on another boat and went all the way to Minnesota instead.
So interesting. Mary, you've read several poems that show that you engaged in as much, in much research as well. Could you talk a little bit about your research path and, how the things that you learned about Eliza? You're muted.
I have been involved in a kind of dance and writing research on slavery for a long time. And one of the results is that in addition to reading as research, I know the music of the time and I know the songs. So once I made a presentation of free papers, the whole book, with songs interspersed. Songs that are not in the book, but that are of my knowledge of work songs, spirituals, and songs that come from that era. So I thought about her being on this plantation that had 600 slaves, and I'm sure then that she heard these songs sung, because this was throughout the South, not limited to one place. And there's a lot of documentation about how the music traveled, folk music traveled with visitors and folks. So I sang Another Man Done Gone. not saying that she was the man, but suggesting that this is the kind of thing that happened, that people in people's experience, a slave would disappear. I sang, he's a chopping in the low ground. He's chopping just to fool you. Oh, good God Almighty, here come the captain. He got his bullwhip with him. That all of those things set a possible context for her, the things that were happening around her. And these songs are, as Du Bois called them, the sorrow songs that came out of the experience of slavery. And it's an unimaginable wealth of connection and collection. So using that kind of research, I imagined what her life could have been. I mean, I don't know it. I don't have the dates and the receipts and those things, but the life of a slave held those things. And these songs are in the words of slaves, the melodies of slaves. And I applied the songs in a way that felt so pertinent to me, that this is what she is escaping from. What is she leaving? She has had a number of experiences, but she has the experience of being sold, of being pawned, so that others could profit from her. So that is one of my methods of research, is to think about and review the music I know from that time, the words, and to review it as the words of slaves from themselves. Their, yeah. Well, that is the beginning of how that went. So I went to the Gale Family Library in Minnesota, and they brought out trays of things from the Winslow house, which is where the Christmases stayed and where Eliza stayed when they came to Minnesota. And so what I was trying to do is to build, in my experience or in my surroundings, a context for this woman who was defying all odds and taking this huge step on her own, and to get inside what she might be feeling as she did these things. Yeah. Poems are kind of long, so for the time we have, when she married Jim Winston, she talks about him a fair amount. Mostly she talks about him in admiration, because she says in her affidavit that she would never marry an enslaved man. It would have to be a free man. Yes. And I, having had the experience of being attracted to someone for those qualities, I imagined this poem from her. Okay. It's called Free Swagger. That is actually a phrase that she used. Free swagger. Jim, they called him, in all his free swagger, coming round to see me, and me sneaking a moment between the kitchen and the back door to hear this Jim. To say something to this Jim who keep coming round. When I fetch the kettle from Mistress Toddy, when I leave off the linen from Mistress' sick room, I saw myself when words took over from just looking and pushed silence away. I saw myself not by myself with this Jim Winston, he said, who keep coming round with his free swagger, gonna buy you free, he said. That man got some nerve, gonna buy me free. And you think you know how? Got a plan. And I know how. And it's us now, not me by myself. Don't you say there ain't no roses in my life.
Mary, in your first poem,
Yes.
you listed the many gifts that we have received from Eliza and her presence. And I know that you, Christopher, and Mary did not know each other when you were doing this research, and yet you were coming at it from these very different vantage points.
Yeah.
And yet you found each other.
Yeah.
And tell us, both of you, how did that happen? This is something that Eliza, it just felt like to me a gift from Eliza, that the two of you who had no idea that each other existed were writing about this same woman in your own particular ways. And here we are tonight.
Mhm. I had written in the voice of Sally Hemings,
Mm-hmm.
also of Harriet Jacobs. And I thought about Eliza, and so much is written about Eliza's effect and her as a catalyst in Minnesota. But it seemed to me nobody was trying to delve into the woman herself. This was an actual person who had feelings, had courage, had standards for herself. When she says, I did my very best, that's not some slave owner telling her that she did very well. She says, no, that I did my very best. That's a part of her character. That is what she wants to do. She's not just a sort of a simpleton who is trying to please. No, she has standards for her work. So all of that grew. I've forgotten the question at this point. Tell me again.
Question was, how did you, Chris, for both of you, how did you
Oh,
guys find each other? And you're
well,
both.
when I heard that Chris was coming to the Twin Cities and was going to speak on Eliza, I felt like I was the first person there, because this is, first of all, it's new information. He has new information for me. And second of all, he has thoughts about her. It took courage. That was my thought about her. That's what I thought about her. I thought, here's this researcher who's got, dates and receipts and all of that. And he has fastened on to the amount of courage in this woman's character. So that was very important to me, to hear him speak. And I gained so much information. My book was already published at that point. So I was not going to go back and rewrite it. And I have a chart that links up the major events of Eliza's life as I understood the timing with the major events in my ancestry. So that in the year that, I'm doing all kinds of math that would have to be redone, but the idea is the same, is that I come from people, as most of us people of color do. I come from people who were slaves. I knew them. I was not born then, but I certainly knew them down the line. And I was constantly looking for the way that her life explains the life of my great grandmother, the way that her life, the things that my great grandmother must have experienced. And what her relationship was with my grandmother, and then what her relationship was with my mother. That's coming right down the line. We told those stories, and there's nothing exhaustive about them, but there is the sense of personhood, agency, courage, defeat sometimes. So those are the things that um, that that pushed me forward as a poet. And I would like to say something about the process of writing poetry. All sorts of stuff comes up. Suddenly, all of a sudden, the name Jim, well, that was my father's name. That was his only connection, but it connected in my head. And then the pride his mother had in him, um, when he got a PhD. This was an early time for him. But what I am tracing is the relationships and the character of the people that I know in this. What isn't in this book, but sometimes I think should be in it, a song I wrote about the generations of my family. And it starts with the line, Anna Mallory was born a slave. That was a phrase that I was taught. I was taught it because it's a truth that we know about our family.
You were taught that by your family members?
No, I made up the song because
No, you
that
said
is the
that.
first line. Anna Mallory was born a slave. She bore two masters' children from cradle to grave. That's all there is to know, say. She found another father for Kate. That's a lineage. We cannot go back farther than that, but those are the things that we know. And it goes on with her, the names of her children, my uncle, my aunt, my etc. I sometimes wish that was in the book because it's truer than any it's more literally.
Maybe there's another book coming, huh?
Well,
But Chris, how did you find Mary? How did you guys find each other?
Well, when I had started with research for my book, free papers came out shortly afterward. And the first opportunity that I could to see her talk about it, I did. And it was a remote meeting that was being hosted by the, the Freedom Library from St. Paul. And I was just amazed at the creative take, the artistic take that Free Papers gave for Eliza Winston's life. And I was also encouraged because the publication of the book and the audience that the book found let me know that there was a market for biographies about Eliza Winston. But that also let me know that I really needed to tell a good story about her life as well. And I wanted to tell a story that was compelling, but that was accurate at the same time. And when I was working on Slavery's Reach, I was mostly concerned with the money that slaveholders spent in Minnesota. I didn't spend a whole lot of time in Slavery's Reach talking about what slavery itself was like in Minnesota, what it was like to be enslaved in what was by 1860 a free state. So I really went into the weeds on that when looking at Eliza's life because I was writing about her being enslaved in Minnesota in 1860. And it is similar and different. What's different in Minnesota is that because slavery was officially illegal, there were no slave pens that I could find. There were no public places for auctions. No whipping posts either. So those things that you associate with slavery being very public, those things were absent in Minnesota. But what was consistent was that enslaved people did not go anywhere without their slaveholders. And if they did, they likely had some kind of not free paper, but some kind of pass with them. In my research, I learned that the free African American local population of the Twin Cities was so small that during the tourism season, the total number of enslaved people that came to the Twin Cities outnumbered the free people who already lived there. So, in the minds of Minnesotans, whenever they saw an African American walking by on the streets of the Twin Cities, they just assumed that person was a slave from out of state and not a local fellow Minnesotan. So I had to really try to understand slavery as something that Minnesotans accepted as something that just happened every spring and summer. And that it was something that Minnesotans, by and large, were willing to live with because the slaveholders brought so much money with them every summer. So they were able to comfort themselves by saying, well, we don't whip anybody, we don't sell anybody. And, legally speaking, once they're in Minnesota, they're free, but they always go back when the tourism season ends. But they would go back because they usually left behind a bunch of family when their masters took them to Minnesota. And again, the free people or the free communities were so small here that there were not resources for anyone to start their lives over in the Twin Cities. But Minnesotans would sort of blame the victim and say, well, one person specifically said that the people who went back were just too stupid to realize that they were free. They actually used the word stupid. But Eliza was different. I mean, she had already been married and lost her husband. I believe she had also at some point been a mother, but lost her kids. So having no family in Mississippi to leave behind, she had nothing to lose to go for her freedom in Minnesota. And she knew that she was supposed to be free. She had already been promised twice, and both promises fell through. So she just tried to find as many people as she could to help her and just give her the resources that she needed to become free. She thought at first that it would be a church, but that fell through. So her next step was the courthouse. And because she had the law on her side, because Minnesota was a free state, it was a no-brainer for the judge.
So I see a comment from Janata Petrus that says, to be enslaved in a free state feels like a continued legacy of Black reality in Minnesota. But before we address that, I want to go back to what you were just about to mention about her in the courts. I had asked earlier for both of you to address the testimony that you both that kind of triggered all of this. You knew about Eliza's testimony to the courts. Can you both say something about that? And then let's talk a little bit about Janata's comment. And everyone else in the audience, if you have questions or comments, please, you can go put them in the chat right now, and we will start, the question section. So talk a little bit about the testimony.
It was so amazing to me.
What did it say?
She was such a cogent teller of her life. I thought this woman is educated some way to use this language and to follow all of these twists and turns. And she spoke, it's obvious to me why she did not go back over her early years. She started from the age she thought she was. And then she told about Macklemore and who he was, about his money troubles and all of those things. You could kind of see her. And I thought that when I first read the testimony to a friend, she said right away, "Oh, she's an educated woman." I said, "No, there's no evidence about that. There's just what she says and her ability to say it. It was great to learn. I mean, I used phrases from my family. Lord, I'm out here on your word. I thought that really describes her situation. She must have prayed or thought about it in some way that helped me out, you know. And then to hear that she had been a member of her church explained a lot of things about it. The testimony is, I don't know what you're getting at. I read that testimony, I don't know, 50 times. I felt like I discovered something, what it meant, something new every time. You know, here I have this idea of her as completely isolated with no friends, and yet, oh, that's what that means when she says, "My friends made got my clothes together for me." Oh, they were sitting around, not sitting around, but when an opportunity presented itself, they were fashioning the clothes or stealing the clothes or whatever they had to do to support her. And then they didn't tell that she had this plan to be free. You know, there are all of these, I guess they're tropes now about, you know, the slave who betters himself by ratting on the others. No, they didn't do any of that. No, they just sat there and they did their sewing and helping her. So that says a lot about who she is, and that she reports that she puts that in. That's the kind of thing that she wants to say to the judge. It's the multiple readings. I just believed her. I just believed everything about her.
Yes, I hear you loud and clear. And
Oh,
you have the testimony in your books.
sorry.
Wonderful. So that, you know, if you borrow the book, audience members, if you borrow the book from the library or purchase either one of them, you will see what they're talking about.
Yeah, the whole testimony is in the back of my book. I wanted
Mhm.
people to be able to test the poems against the words that she wrote.
Mhm.
So they're right there. The two things are there together. And it just seemed essential that everybody should hear not only my poetic version of her words, but the actual words.
Actual words, yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to comment on the testimony, Chris?
Certainly. One thing that struck me once I learned about her being connected to President Jackson and then by the Polks through President Polk was that she doesn't mention that at all in her affidavit. And that let me know that in her affidavit, in her case for saying why she should be free, she didn't put on airs at all. She didn't say, well, I was enslaved by the president of the United States. I mean, that just wasn't important to her. What was important to her was that she had gone from Mr. Mackmore to the Golsons to the Christmases, and the Christmases didn't free her, but Emily Gray and her friends helped her become free in the courthouse. And that's that. And what I also appreciate about the affidavit is that she freely talked about the choices that she made and the things that she had the power to do. I mean, it at first glance may seem um, rather irrelevant for her to say, I changed from my washing dress to my calico dress before going to the courthouse. But that was actually quite a gesture of agency to take off this clothing that she had been using for the purposes of her labor and to put on something finer when she's about to go become free. It is quite a powerful gesture. And I'm glad that she wrote that she did that. That certainly gave me a window into her personality. And the reason that I think that Eliza was a mother was because when she talked about um, taking care of the Christmas baby, Norma, she said specifically, I have nursed and taken care of this infant. And I was thinking, well, why is nurse and taking care in the same sentence? Is that redundant? And I thought, well, it may not be if she had already been a mother biologically herself. And I found in her time in Tennessee that there was one year where the Golsons were taxed for having a certain number of slaves. And then there was another year when the number went higher, and then another year when the number went lower. And I cross referenced that with the receipts from slave sales, and I noticed that there weren't any during those years for the Golsons. So the only way that there could be an increase in slaves is if Eliza gave birth to one, since she was the only woman enslaved by them. And for that number to disappear, if nobody was sold, would have meant that the slave died.
So we can open it up for questions and comments now. Do either of you want to comment on what Janata Petrus said? To be enslaved in a free state feels like a continued legacy of Black reality in Minnesota.
I think it's true. I mean, I would have to say it figuratively because I don't have a list of statistics, but
other than what we live every day.
Right. And what people suffer. You know, you have friends, you read the paper, you know where the law is unevenly applied, where the protections of the law are often absent. Or
yes.
I would agree with the statement as well. I felt all sorts of powerful emotions when George Floyd was killed, not just as a fellow African American man in Minnesota, but as it turns out, George Floyd and I shared a birthday down to the year. So, there before the grace of God go I, this person who lived on this earth for the same amount of time as me, until that fateful day in May 2020. And I think about that, and I think about Minnesota and St. Cloud in general, and just how sometimes when you're not used to seeing a group of people in great numbers, that population can seem invisible and therefore irrelevant. Now, St. Cloud is interesting because the town was founded in 1856, but the African American population was largely in the single digits until the 1960s. And that was when government facilities like the prison here in town, the university, and the VA hospital started to desegregate their workforces. But to go from the 1850s to the 1960s means that the families who were here first got a whole century jump on the people of color who came afterward. And the city council was created in the same year as St. Cloud was established in 1856. And it wasn't until last month that the city council finally had a member who was not European American. the first time in 169 years.
Mm.
So progress can be slow. Progress is slow, but sometimes you have a good day and you have to appreciate the good days, but then get back to the fight.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a comment from Donna Isaac. She said, I'm drawn to the idea that Eliza changed her garment in order to declare her freedom, an almost symbolic choice of raiment, choice, thank God.
Mhm.
That is very significant that that she did that she changed from her work clothes
Mhm.
to a beautiful calico dress to go stand before the judge and say, hey.
And she didn't know it was necessarily going to go her way. In
Right.
fact, when she left the courtroom, a mob followed her.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And they spirited her away to an abolitionist house. And the mob raged the entire night. And I don't have the name of the abolitionist's wife, but she pulled a rifle on the mob to keep them out, and she was pregnant.
Wow.
And that was not a part of my story because I'm telling Eliza's story.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that in the research.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not a simple thing that the judge comes and says, "Oh, you're free, everything's fine." She's not free. She is legally out of the slave system, but she is in great peril.
Mm-hmm.
And the amount of money, well, there were raging articles and things in the newspapers, and it got so bad that some of the newspapers who wrote on her side well about her had their offices raided and their printing presses thrown in the river.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not a gentleman's agreement that was going on. It was really, it was a culture war.
Right. And
If I could use a phrase that's current.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but the mob was a mob of Minnesotans. It wasn't a mob of slaveholders who were angry. The slaveholders were too busy running back to the hotels, grabbing their slaves, and getting on the next steamboat back to the South. So those slaves wouldn't go face the judge. There was Minnesotans who were really upset that Judge Vanderburg had broken this unwritten rule that Minnesotans don't mess with a master-slave relationship in Minnesota, even though it's illegal.
Mm-hmm.
But Minnesotans stood to lose a lot of money from tourism if Southerners were going to be too scared to come to Minnesota anymore, now that they know that Minnesotans would actually free their slaves in Minnesota. So these Minnesotans were the ones who did the rioting. And the sheriff of Hennepin County ultimately was able to disperse the mobs. Nobody was arrested at all, even the people who vandalized Emily Gray's house and came at the Babbitts. Mrs. Babbitt was the one with the shotgun.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was local anger that night that Eliza was freed.
And tell them who Mrs. Gray was. You mentioned her.
Oh,
mm-hmm.
Yeah, Emily Gray was a free African American woman who was from Pennsylvania. And she and her husband had come here in the 1850s, not too long before Eliza Winston came. And Emily was herself raised by abolitionist parents. Her father was a former slave who had been freed. And in Pennsylvania, her parents' house served sometimes as part of the Underground Railroad there. So when Emily was helping Eliza Winston in Minnesota, she was taking some of that family legacy from her parents' Underground Railroad with her.
And you do have in your book some of the newspaper articles that you were talking about, how the Minnesotans, the newspaper articles are chilling. And the pictures. Are there other questions or comments? Let me ask the two of you. You've both done beautiful work about Eliza Winston, and you've both had public conversations, poetry readings. What are some of the questions that you wish people would ask that you'd like to address? And also, there's a Kia Vang just put in the chat the survey that we would love for you all to fill before you leave tonight, please. People in the audience, go ahead. What are some questions you wish people would ask? While you're thinking about that, there is another comment from Kidnor. I feel that when we assume that someone needs to be educated to be cogent, articulate, and so on, is a product of colonization, it almost carries that savage mentality that helps perpetuate racism. Trying to figure out the right way to phrase this, not trying to be antagonistic, just wondering if this is potential possibility.
Well, I think that's always a possibility. But on the other hand, if you read the words of a person, you're making judgments about how well they're handling it. You are. And what allows them to do that. We've been fed the wrongness of Ebonics and all of that forever. I mean, the idea that slaves could not speak well, could not explain themselves well. And of course, that's underlined by the fact that people are under duress speaking a language that they do not know.
Yes.
And they are speaking it, research has shown that they are speaking it according to the rules of the language where they came from. So the use of the word be, I be doing this, I be doing that, is used in a particular kind of way. But the absorption of the English language in a way that was one of the things that struck me about the affidavit, is that she wasn't using any of that. She was using the English language as spoken by white people. So it is not just the assumption that because she speaks well and cogently, it's not a simple assumption. And so a part of colonization, no doubt it is a part of it. She learned to speak a language that would serve her existence and keep her safe. But she doesn't say anywhere in that's why I'm speaking this well, people. She just speaks. Yeah. So I think that's kind of jumping to, I like the fact that you say you're wondering if it is a potential possibility. Yeah, but maybe that's going too far with it. Maybe that's looking at it from a contemporary point of view.
Interesting.
Well, I think that because she had spent so much time in urban areas, and again, enslaved by very powerful people who often held parties where other powerful people came and visited. If their way of speaking is what you're surrounded by in your more formative years, then that's just how you're going to talk. And add to that being able to learn how to read, that gives all sorts of possibilities for people to be able to express themselves
Mm-hmm.
in ways that opens up avenues to them. And perhaps the way that Eliza Winston spoke, based on the text in her affidavit, that might have helped in her favor with the judge because he was able to clearly understand what she was trying to say
Mm-hmm.
about her case for freedom. Now, you had asked about what I wish people would ask at events like these. One question that came to mind was, do you see yourself in Eliza? And I certainly do, largely because of my experiences being a fish out of water and sometimes, or oftentimes, being one of few African Americans in a particular context, sometimes the only African American. And Eliza, no doubt, experienced that once she came to Minnesota. So I was trying to tap into the feelings I had as a native Oklahoman coming to Minnesota for the first time, as someone whose parents and grandparents are all from the South, some from the Deep South. And with Eliza coming from Mississippi to Minnesota, what's it like for her to come from the Deep South to Minnesota? I know my own culture shock coming here. So I was trying to see what that would have been like for someone coming up the Mississippi River in 1860. Not only being around European Americans in great numbers, but also what it means to eat foods in the way that they prepare, since European Americans are the ones on the boats and in the hotels who are making food in the kitchens. So if you're accustomed to cooking food for everybody or eating food from what another slave cooked, then you're used to Southern foodways and Southern seasonings and so forth. That's different from what you'll find in Minnesota. It is the difference between Southern fried catfish in the Deep South and lutefisk here. It's a big difference, and that's part of what Eliza would have had to navigate. And I could certainly relate to that.
What do you think Eliza's experience and life speak to the experience of Black Minnesotans? Also, so fascinated by Southern tourism in Minnesota and that sudden population of temporary Blackness. Interesting comment again from Janata. And several people are thanking us for this, and I'm hoping that you guys are filling out the survey as well. Please do that for us.
Well, I I feel like I want to just add a comment. I am so appreciative of the work of Christopher Lehman. I feel like, for a long time, I have used my imagination along with research to speak in the voices of enslaved Black women. And I think I've been pretty successful with it, but it is incredible to do that and then to have a scholar sort of reaffirm various points that are in it. It is really it's like I value it more in a way. It's more than a figment of my imagination.
Thank you. I feel the same way about your book. I knew that I had to wait until my book was done before I could read Free Papers in its entirety, or else the creativity that you brought to Eliza would have certainly colored the way that I portrayed her. But once I read Free Papers, I was struck by how much of what I had focused on you had too. like in that poem that you read,
Yeah.
where you call out, or you mention Eliza asking Mrs. Christmas, "Why didn't you free me in St. Louis?" I mean, I put that same quote in my book
Ah.
because, um,
Mhm.
well, Eliza had mentioned it in her affidavit, and I thought, well,
Mhm.
that is really bold of her to say that to her mistress, but she's about to leave the mistress and go to
Yeah.
court, so
Mhm.
she could talk back to her that way, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Oh, okay. Wow. This is really interesting. I just asked Nia to close the um, speaker. Yeah, so we can see everyone in the audience here. I don't know how to do it, but Nia, can
See
you
in the audience?
trying to see the people? Hey, here we go. We're getting there slowly. Oh, hi, Anne and others.
Oh my, look at that.
Yeah, can you unspotlight Mary? Take Mary out of the spotlight. Yeah.
Well, I would, this makes me want to add some thanks because Anne Reagan is a person who was instrumental in getting Christopher to Minnesota and who said to me about my book that she had not thought of Eliza as a human woman until she read my book. And that was, I was very, very flattered by that. Flattery is not the right word for it, but honored by it. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah,
Yeah.
so
This was an absolutely lovely conversation, and still trying to find. I'm not good with technology, but that's okay.
I kind of want to answer a question from
Yes.
Janata along those lines of these um, of what we've been discussing. Did any Black folks attempt to get free by obfuscating without legal permission? Oh my God, there's a whole wealth of slave narratives. William Box Brown, he mailed himself to freedom.
Mm.
That was that's one example. I can't think of all, but there are others. And what's the name of the couple? The the wife looked white and the husband was black, and he traveled with her as her servant to
Mhm.
freedom. Okay, I'll think of the name later, I'm sure.
It's all right, but that's some really interesting information.
Mhm.
Um,
Kraft was their name.
okay.
Ellen was the woman's name, and I forget the husband. I think William was his
Oh,
name.
yes. Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you, Carlisle. Mhm.
Thanks, Carlisle. How do we, let's see, I'm trying to ask. Are there other questions or comments? Janatus asked if the people
Oh,
you're talking about were specifically in Minnesota. I think they probably were.
Well, I know that there were people in St. Paul who helped with uh, enslaved people who were able to run away all the way up to Galena, Illinois. And they worked with those people to ultimately get them to Canada.
mhm.
So one thing that I make clear in my book is that the people who are helping Eliza Winston in Minneapolis are a separate group of abolitionists. They're not connected to the National Underground Railroad, or at least they don't connect until they get Eliza from Minneapolis to St. Paul, and the people in St. Paul get her to Detroit ultimately, if not to Canada. But there's great potential for Minneapolis to become part of the National Underground Railroad. It's just that half a year after Eliza was freed, the Civil War broke out. And then all the Southerners who used to come up here just decided to stay in the South and defend their new country, the Confederacy. So the Civil War killed the tourism market right away. Winslow House, all those other hotels, they closed before the end of the war.
Mhm.
Looks like there's one more. William and Ellen Craft
Yes.
on the East Coast. Can you say more about them? Who were they?
That was the couple that she traveled. She looked white and she traveled
Oh, that's the, okay.
to freedom. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And he traveled as her servant.
Mm.
Well, they say servant, but that is one of those misnomers from the South. They constantly talk about, oh, and the servants lived here. And my question was always, do you mean slaves? Is that who you're talking about? Yes.
Mm. Mm.
Well, I have a comment to make. I've read Mary's book and I've started in on Chris's book. I'm really excited to hear from Chris's book about what happened to Eliza after all this took place. And I think each of you has kind of fulfilled a different way of viewing the whole event and telling about it. And that's that. And you have, each book enriches the other.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I hope that you'll do more of these, either with us or people around the world. It's really fascinating. And Mary, I want to know, I mean, the song that you sang was just really haunting and beautiful. Are you working on any more music and or choreography around Eliza Winston?
No, that is the truthful answer. I wrote that song a long time ago, and I have sung it in different kinds of performance venues as a part of different shows. And I realized that as I talk about it, I have never, I have never published it. The song itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's just really beautiful.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it comes from your own personal history.
Yeah. Personal history is kind of my big thing.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we have the title now of the book about the crafts, Master, Slave, Wife, An Epic Journey from Slavery to Freedom by Ilion Wu, perhaps. Thank you, Sherry. All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. And Anne Regan, I hope you are happy with what you created here. I mean, she didn't, I mean, you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yes.
Really good to see you.
I was so fortunate to be able to participate. I didn't, editors are just sort of lucky people who get to help things move along. And when they say, oh, this is wonderful, somebody takes that as something that's important, it's really great. I have loved hearing the two of you in conversation. Really, really powerful. That the factual story and the emotional story that both of you are telling, both of you are paying attention to the facts, both of you are working with the emotions, and it all comes right through the readers. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I was just really blown away. I mean, I know Mary's work, but I was blown away to see that Chris did that as well. That his book was not just a little history book of names, dates, but no, he really dove into this woman and her life and her family and everything that happened from there to here, like both of you did in your own separate ways. And it's just so, I'm so grateful. I am so grateful to have been able to do this with you tonight.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
You are taking it the next step. You know, we had a conversation once that attracted 4 people, and we got off into it and we got lots of talking. But I will just say that Mary Tavris owns the only Black bookstore in downtown Minneapolis. She's a one-woman operation, and she brought together some fantastic things, but widespread publicity was not an ace that she could master.
Mm-hmm.
So two people heard about it, and I brought my friend who set up chairs and directed things for people. So, but it was great. But those people participated in our exchange, talking about where they were from and how our conversation had to do with the lives they had lived.
Everyone, it's called Strive Bookstore, Susan.
Yes, yes.
Downtown Minneapolis. And, you know, I mean, I know that Mary and all the rest of us do the best we can.
Sure, of course.
And she opened the door and here we are tonight.
Yes,
And
yes.
again, you know, with excuse me, we had 90 some people register for this event and I think 50 showed up, but that's still a good number.
Oh yeah.
But you can't always, you know, I mean, you just don't know. You put it out there and Jim Seelar and you and me and our people at More Than a Single Story and all of us put it out there in the library. And yeah, people knew about it, which I think is really good because
that was terrific. That was
yeah, I think that even though 90 people didn't show up, 90 people know about it. And, you know, hopefully it's going to just generate more readings of your books, more conversation. Yeah, I'm just so super excited. Shavonda, she said there's also, yeah, Black Garnet books in St. Paul. Do you know who owns Black Garnet now? Does Shavonda there's a new owner, right?
Yes, there is a new owner, another Black woman.
And who is she?
Whose name I do not know.
Okay. Yeah, I knew Dion sold it. Okay. All right. So are you guys happy with what happened tonight?
I'm very happy.
Oh, I am too.
Did you like the slideshow?
I did, yes.
Yes.
The music got, you know, we had to, yeah. But yeah, we always, that's.
I would like to thank you.
Huh?
Go ahead. My daughter wants to say something. Go ahead, Lola.
Oh, say something, daughter.
Winston. Say it again. Winston. Say it one more time. Eliza Winston.
All right. Eliza Winston. See, we're teaching people. Yes, we are. Thank you, Kia.